Cell theory is a concept within biology, and it is used to define a cell for a living organism. Now, when we talk about cell theory, it's important to remember that we are not talking about non-living objects or organisms. So that means we are not talking about our air, rocks, sand, because those are all non-living. We're talking about our living organisms, for example, a dolphin, a cat, a prokaryote, a paramecium, things like that. Those are living organisms, and cell theory constitutes those living organisms. Now, modern cell theory is made up of 6 postulates. And the first postulate is that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. So this is a very important postulate because oftentimes when we think of something living, we think of a dog, or we think of a human, or a tiger, or maybe a tree, and all of these organisms are actually multicellular. We often neglect our unicellular organisms as organisms, for example, the prokaryote, the amoeba, the algae. It's important to remember that a living organism can be composed of one cell or many cells, okay? Now, the second postulate is that cells arise from pre-existing cells. This is also very important to understand because this means that cells cannot occur spontaneously. They must come from a pre-existing cell. So how do we define that in terms of living organisms? How do we get cells? Well, we get them through mitosis or meiosis. And remember, mitosis and meiosis is essentially taking a single cell, duplicating the number of chromosomes which contain that genetic information, and then producing these daughter cells that may be genetically completely identical, or they may be slightly different when we talk about meiosis. So cells come from pre-existing cells. So we have the cell division, a simple example over here, specifically mitosis and meiosis, and they will not occur spontaneously. The next is cells contain genetic information in the form of DNA, and that information is passed down to each daughter cell, and it can also be passed down through transcription and translation. So remember that when we talk about the pass down of genetic information, when we mean the direct transfer of genetic information, we often think of cell division, where we have that parent cell and then we get those 2 daughter cells, and that genetic information is passed down from that mother cell. Well, that genetic information can also be expressed or passed down through transcription and translation. Remember when we talk about a eukaryotic cell, we have that DNA enclosed within that nuclear envelope and it cannot exit the nucleus. So that's where the RNA comes in and it transcribes that DNA, produces that mRNA strand which will encode for a protein. That's also another way that genetic information can be expressed or transferred or read. So essentially, cells will contain genetic information. They have this information, and that's passed down. The next postulate is that the cell is the fundamental unit of life. Now, what does this mean? This means, this is very similar to our first postulate when we say that something can be single-celled or multicellular. Basically, it means that a single cell, that is the fundamental unit of which life can be defined. So life, the smallest unit of life, is one cell. Okay, so here we actually have this prokaryote. We have a eukaryote, prokaryote versus eukaryote. Remember, prokaryotes are going to be single-celled, but eukaryotes do not have to be single-celled. We can have multicellular eukaryotes, but we can also have single-celled eukaryotes. And in each case, eukaryotic or prokaryotic, it does not matter. The cell, a single cell, is the fundamental or the smallest unit in which life can exist. The next postulate is that all cells have that basic chemical composition. Specifically, we are talking about the nucleotides in our DNA. Remember, we have A and G as our purines and C and T as our pyrimidines. A stands for adenine, G for guanine, T for thymine, and C for cysteine. all of these four nucleotides are found in all cells. They may be in different compositions because remember we can have, it's like the alphabet, right? We can have A, T, C, G, A, T. It can occur in a different way, in a different composition, but those letters will be the same in all cells. And then our last postulate is that energy flow occurs within the cell. Now, when we think about energy flow, we often think of the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell for eukaryotes, and that is true. That's where we see the most ATP production in a eukaryotic cell. But what about prokaryotes that do not have a mitochondria? Does that mean that energy flow still occurs in the cell? Yes, the energy flow will still occur within the cell because in this case, the energy production can occur across that cell membrane of a prokaryote or any single-celled organism that does not have a mitochondria. And those are the 6 postulates of our modern cell theory.